Welcome all, and thank you for joining today's ADBRI webinar. My name is Matt Holdstock and I'm an enologist at the ADBRI. In today's session, we'll be provided with an overview of the 2023 National Vintage Report. In the spirit of reconciliation, the ADBRI acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respect to their elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. I'd also like to acknowledge that Wine Australia for providing funding and support for the webinar program via the ADBRI Extension Project. Now, before we jump in and make a start, a couple of quick reminders to anyone who is new to the ADBRI webinar program. If you would like to provide a comment or ask a question, please click on the Q&A button on the Zoom toolbar, type in your question and click to send it through. We will hold a Q&A session at the end of this presentation, but feel free to send through your questions at any stage this morning. A reminder also that this session is being recorded and the link sent through to you later today to view via the ADBRI's YouTube channel. We would also like to collect data today on your knowledge of this topic. You should see a one question survey pop onto your screen asking you to rate how much you know about the 23 National Vintage Report. And if you could also please rate your knowledge on this topic on a scale between 0 and 10 now, with 0 being nothing and 10 being an expert. At the conclusion of today's webinar and after the Q&A, we will prompt you again with another single question to establish your knowledge on the topic after the webinar. And again, you'll be asked to rate your knowledge on the scale between 0 and 10. For anyone who has just joined, welcome. Today's webinar topic is an overview of the 23 National Vintage Report, and it's a great pleasure to welcome Sandy Hathaway from Wine Australia. Sandy Hathaway is a senior analyst in the Market Insights team at Wine Australia. Sandy has particular responsibility for the National Vintage and Direct-to-Consumer Surveys, the VinSights Vineyard Mapping Program, and Domestic Market Insights. Sandy has been involved in the Australian wine sector for more than 20 years in a number of roles and has been with Wine Australia since 2016. We'll be conducting a number of polls throughout today's webinar, so when you're prompted on the screen for a request from a poll or a question, please fill out the poll and we'll be referring to that throughout the presentation. Sandy, if you're ready, I'll hand this over to you.
Thanks, Matt, and good morning, everyone. And thank you for making the time to hear this presentation today. I hope that I don't get asked to rate my knowledge at the end of this survey, but yeah, this of course is my pet topic, and as some of you know, it's something like my 27th vintage, and I've been doing almost as many national vintage surveys, so it'll probably be a little bit garbled, so do stop me if I start talking about things that make sense to nobody else. Okay, so what we'll look at by way of outline is the overview of the vintage and the conditions that give it context. We'll look at the crush by variety, by state and region. We'll look at what the price data told us, and then spend some time on the global market conditions, which really explain some of the data that you see in the vintage report. So do make sure you stay for that. And then a little brief look at perhaps what next vintage might bring. And finally, a mention of the one sector plan, which some of you may have heard of. Again, if not, make sure you stay around to hear about that. All right. So if you wouldn't mind, maybe if you could just put in your region, which region do you most associate with? Of course, some of you, you probably got a number. You can put all or many or a whole state. I'm just interested to see the range of regions that people are from on the call today. And I'll, reflect back on that in a minute. So looking nationally, and I mean, we really are very fortunate at Wine Australia. We do have data going back a very long time, and it's not been since the year 2000 that we've seen a vintage as small as the 2023 vintage. Although having said that, the data wasn't as good in 2000. It may have actually been a bit higher than that. And the other thing is 2003 was very close, and the vineyard area was slightly higher in 2003, which means that perhaps that was a slightly lower yielding vintage than this one, but they're certainly very comparable. And the other thing you can see is what happened after 2003. There was a very big jump up, which I think we're probably hoping not to see next year. So looking in a little bit more in close up at the last, just the last 10 years, the 2023 crush was 26% below our 10-year average. And so if you think about that, you know, think of a pie, you've just taken a quarter of that pie out. And so essentially for every 4 tonnes that were crushed last year, only 3 were crushed this year. So it really is quite a big difference. It's around 465,000 tonnes less than last year, less than the average, which equates to about 325 million litres of wine. I think probably most people don't need telling and don't want reminding about the vintage conditions, but for the record, we know that vintage was very difficult in 2022-23 season. After the 3rd La Nina in a row, Australia had the wettest year since 2011 and the coolest since 2012. This led to flooding in some regions, including a flood in the Riverland that was bigger than anything since 1956. Flooding did not directly affect very many vineyards because vineyards are not generally planted on the floodplain, but the secondary effects were significant. So obviously, you know, the waterlogged vineyards, just from the sheer amount of rain, power was sometimes switched off, access was difficult, disease pressure was relatively high, and then compounding that was you've got the disease pressure, but it's difficult to get into the vineyard to do your spray programs. Staff shortages were also an issue, and chemical shortages. So growers really are to be commended hugely for what they did in bringing in another really good vintage under these conditions. The low yields and the late ripening caused obviously low yield, but to some extent was potentially a positive, with quality often associated with lower yields. And again, the late slow ripening leading to good flavour development, but that did depend on whether sugar accumulation was sufficient or not. A second major driver of the low vintage was that we know that there was a reduced demand for fruit, and that some wineries were choosing not to take fruit in one way or another. So they might impose a yield cap, they might have encouraged growers to rest vineyards, even paid them to do so, or simply not taking uncontracted fruit and leaving some growers with fruit that was either unharvested or was harvested onto the ground. Excuse me. Given that our vintage survey is a crush survey, what that means is we record what goes through the weighbridge. So we don't know what we don't know. We don't know what wasn't harvested, and we don't know of what wasn't harvested, how much of that was due to the seasonal conditions and how much was due to, if you like, a choice factor. My sense is that it's largely seasonal. The seasonal issues were so widespread, and also the fact that reds and whites were affected roughly equally, and own-grown and purchased grapes were affected roughly equally, which suggests that the seasonal factors were more of a driver than choice. But having said that, you could speculate that if the vintage had the potential to be an average or above average crop, would we then have seen more of the effect of not taking grapes? Because I think what we actually saw anecdotally was uncontracted grapes being picked up in some regions where there was more supply, because there was even less supply in other regions. So it's a question we can't answer. It's really every individual grower's situation was probably a little bit different. So yeah, looking at the red and white, the red was down by more than the white, down by 26% compared with last year, whereas the white was down 22% compared with last year. And so it was less, down by less in absolute terms as well as percentage terms. But if you look at the 10-year average, the reds were down 25%, so, you know, a quarter, and whites were down 28%. So sorry about all the numbers, but what that means is whites are down by more compared with their average than reds were, which shows you that essentially whites have been on a downward trend in addition to the seasonal factors. And that's sort of clearly illustrated in this next slide. So what I've done here is, if you look at 2015, I've taken the red and the white crush and said, like, assume that's just one, that's 100%. And in fact, in that year, the red and whites were 50-50. And then you look at the following year's crush for red in the orange and white in the green, relative to that 2015 number. And as you can see, the 16, 17 in particular, you're starting to see far more red compared with that benchmark than white. And whites are kind of sat around that benchmark 2015 level and then started declining from 2019 onward. Whereas the reds have generally been above that. And in particular, of course, in 2021, if you think about 2021, which was a record crush, almost all of the increase relative to 2015 was red. And we know why. The strong demand from China had led to a strong demand for red, and growers responded, and we had a really good harvest of red, which then unfortunately turned out not to be able to be sold to China. So by 2023, as you can see, the white crush is now only 71% of what it was in 2015, whereas the red crush is 83%. And I guess I'm drawing this out to show you how red is still very much the dominant color in Australia. All right, so now we'll move on and look at the crush by variety. And just before I start, I've got another question for you. So a little poll is going to pop up here. Which major red variety and which major white variety do you think has grown most in relative terms since 2015? And what I mean by that is not in actual tons, but in percentage terms compared with its starting point. So while you're having a think about that, if you could put it in the poll, let's look at the top 10 reds. So of the top 10, the three big ones were hit the hardest. And again, if you look at the difference in the bars between last year and this year, which are in terms of tons, you can see that almost all the tonnage difference comes from those three big reds. And Cabernet Sauvignon in particular is hit really hard, down 39%. And strangely, Shiraz only down 20%. And in fact, that's all pretty much due to one region, which I'll come back to. The big movers here where you've got your Sangiovese came into the top 10 at the expense of Ruby Cabernet, which had a really big drop. And Grenache moved up one place to overtake Durif. But again, you can see from the size of the bars just how small even these top 10 varieties are compared with your top two big ones. Looking at the whites, top 10 whites, we can see that Prosecco, apologies for the spelling, also moved up one place, overtaking Muscadet Petit Grand, which had the biggest decrease in relative terms. But Chardonnay dropped by 29%, and as a result lost share from being 46% of the whites last year to only 42% this year. And Sauvignon Blanc increased its share. When we then look at the overall top 10, strangely, Shiraz has actually gained share, and that's because it was only down 20%. The other one to gain share was the Sauvignon Blanc, while Chardonnay and Cabernet and Merlot in particular lost share. And Sauvignon Blanc has now actually moved up to being the fourth largest variety in Australia, overtaking Merlot. There are only 4 reds in the top 10, which was the same last year, but even so, they account for 53% of the tons in that group, although that is down from 55% last year. All right, now can we have a look at the results of the poll? Let's see how you went, and I'll give you a clue, although it's of course too late. It's none of those top 10. What have we got? You did not answer the question. Or was that just me? I didn't answer the question. I know the answer. Are we seeing share? Okay, it's not working. That's all right. I will let you know the answer and you can pat yourselves on the back if you got it right. All right, so, and this analysis I think is important. I'd be very interested to know what people did think. Maybe you thought Pinot Noir, maybe Grenache, but actually, again, I've done the same thing as before, and I've said 2015 is like level. Well, in fact, this is the overall tons, but when I've done the analysis compared with 2015, the only reds to have shown any growth as far as 2022 were Durif and Malbec, with Malbec being 3 times what it was in 2015, and Durif just slightly less than 3 times. The only other one that's actually higher than it was in 2015 in 2022 was Grenache. So I've left out 2023 because it was such a low vintage. So Grenache was just slightly above, but even Pinot Noir is basically pretty much where it was in 2015. So we're seeing almost no change in the varietal base over that time in those varieties. And all the other major varieties, Shiraz, Merlot, etc., they are all less in 2022 than they were in 2015. And then looking at the whites, the only one to grow over that period was Prosecco. And it's hard to see, it's a little blue line down the bottom, and that just shows you once again how insignificant these varieties are. And the 5 I've put on this scale don't even include Chardonnay, because then everything else would be squished down the bottom, because Chardonnay is more than double the Sauvignon Blanc. But Sauvignon Blanc is basically the same as 2015. Pinot Gris is down, all the others are down, but Prosecco is 7 times what it was in 2015. So that's that piece of information about growth. Very small changes in the varietal mix. And then when we look at, in the vintage report, a lot of people are very interested in this. So 96% of the crush is the top 10 reds and the top 10 whites, 96%. And then the other 4% is made up of around 100 varieties. And it's probably actually a bit more than that, because our survey, as you know, depends on people reporting to us, and perhaps some of the smaller wineries with the more alternative varieties, they're perhaps less likely to report the full numbers. So we may be underreporting these minor varieties, but they're pretty minor. So I just thought I'd show you that of those 100, the ones showing growth in the reds, Dolcetto, Gamay, Isabella, Tarango, Tintacao, and of the whites, Crucian and Sauvagnin. They were the ones that I picked out as showing the most growth relative to their starting point. All right, and now we will move on and look at the crush by state and region. Looking across the states, South Australia was the largest, no surprises there. The interesting thing was South Australia had a crush similar to its 2020 size and equal smallest since 2007, 17% below its 10-year average. But despite this, it actually increased its share of the national crush because it didn't decrease by as much as the other states. And that's really about a couple of things. Firstly, WA and Queensland, despite their large size on the map, account for a very small proportion of the crush, so their changes don't make much difference to the overall shares. And Victoria and New South Wales are dominated by the inland regions, Riverina and Murray-Darling Swan Hill. And those were the ones that were down, stealing my punchline for the next slide here. But so then as a whole state, they had the bigger decreases because they had less of the other regions to make up for those declines in the big inland regions. And this illustrates that point for you. The inland regions, or warm inland, however you like to describe them, Riverland, Murray-Darling Swan Hill and Riverina, plus the rest of those zones and little areas like Paracuta, they were down by 28%. And if you look at the difference in size between those two bars, you can see that in tonnage terms as well, they accounted for almost all of the drop in tonnage. Whereas the cool temperate regions were down by 14%, but in tonnage terms, it was barely 100,000 tonnes difference. And so that affects the mix. And it means the inland regions dropped their share from 72% last year to 68%, which is the lowest for some time. They normally account for about 3/4 of our crush. This year, it's barely more than 2/3, which is quite a significant difference. Now, the next thing, we're going to look at some regions. So I don't know what all your regions are, but I hope I will cover off on them. And in the Q&A at the end, if you want to ask about a particular region, you can, because I've brought some more information with me. Plus, what I want to tell you is all of the next few slides are simply screenshots that I've taken from the Wine Australia Vintage Survey dashboard, which is brilliant. And please, if you haven't looked at it yet, please do. If you can't find it or you can't make sense of it, send me an email and I will show you how to use it, because you can get all this data yourself for your own regions, and it's fantastic. All right, so we think the 2023 vintage was very low, lowest in a generation. However, there were some regions for which it was actually quite a good region, vintage, both in terms of size and value. So, for example, the Barossa Valley, which is the largest region outside the inland regions and always has been, that had the largest crush since 2017, 34% above last year. And its Shiraz crush was 50% higher than last year, which pretty much explains that overall decrease in the Shiraz not being as much as the other two varieties. So that's a little snapshot from the Barossa Valley dashboard. You can see there, the line is the average value, which has come down, has been coming down since 2021, but the crush, sitting there pretty high, highest since 2017. Now, what do you think is region number 2? And I didn't check this, but I would be confident to say that pretty much over the last 10 years, the top 3 regions have all been South Australian. But this year, it was Margaret River. And Margaret River jumped to being the second largest cool temperate region, compared with 6th last year, after having an excellent vintage. And we know that WA really had much better conditions. It was much drier and didn't suffer either drought or being overly wet. So in Margaret River, the crush was up 9% and the average value was up 10%. So all in all, it was a good mix. Now, Will's showing me the regions. So we've got one from everywhere, haven't we? We've got a few from the Barossa. There's a Margaret River, Yarra Valley, lots of more Barossas. Fantastic. So good that there's such a big range here. So thank you very much for putting that in, everybody. And I can't possibly go through all the regions, so you're going to have to go to the dashboard. All right. So Margaret River, good vintage. Certainly, we are also having a better response rate from the Margaret River. So some of this increase is because more people are responding to the survey, which is great. And here they are, I've jumped to number 2 region as a result. Number 3, any guesses? Again, this is just going to have to be personal pride. But the number 3 region was also different from usual. And it was, oops, forgot this slide. It was Hathaway, which was the 3rd largest region. So despite actually having a pretty small vintage, Hathaway, down 7%, and you can see that in the scheme of things, it's much lower than some of its recent vintages. But because it didn't drop by as much as everywhere else, it ended up 3rd largest region. I'm actually just going to drop back. I'm sorry, I forgot about this slide. This is Margaret River again. I wanted to show you the variety profile, because this variety profile is a little bit different from the typical Australian region profile, which is Shiraz first, Cabernet second, Chardonnay in there somewhere. This one is dominated by Sauvignon Blanc and Cabernet, with Semillon third. So a real dominance of white for a start, 3/4 of Margaret River being white varieties, and Shiraz not featuring in the top 4. And I think this partly explains the increase in value that goes with this region. All right, so there's Hathaway. I've shown you this. This isn't number 4, Claire, but I just thought I'd show you Claire. So I've started picking a few out now. Number 4 is Langhorne Creek. But Clare Valley was interesting because although its crush was down 12%, it's actually above its 10-year average. And its value has really shown quite strong increases ever since 2018. So really bucking that trend we've seen in other regions and showing something of a recovery in favour this region, which is good to see. And then the last one that I'm going to show you is the King Valley. Again, like somewhere around an average crush, but value also increasing. And the interesting thing for me about the King Valley is just how different its variety profile is, because the top variety in the King Valley is Prosecco. 43% of the King Valley crush is Prosecco, with Pinot Gris second. So once again, more than 3/4 are white varieties. And in fact, there isn't even a red. But what is it? It's probably more like 80% are white varieties in the King Valley. So quite an interesting, different region variety profile. All right, so that's the regions. And now we'll move on and talk about price. A less happy topic, I guess we could say. But if you look at this table, I'll ask you to start by looking at the bottom line. The average value overall this year increased from $630 last year to $642. And a lot of people are quite surprised at that, given, again, the anecdotal experience of and the oversupply situation and issues like that. The main reason that the overall average has increased is, well, it's two things. One is that the cool temperate prices are up. And the second is that the mix has changed. So if you think about average values for the inland regions being somewhere around the $300 to $400 mark, and for the inland regions being somewhere around the $1,500 mark, when the amount of cool temperate fruit in the mix increases, it obviously has an extra effect on the prices, increasing the overall average. This table has a lot of information in it, in fact, you can tease out, because what you can see is the cool temperate regions, prices were all up. Reds were up even, whites were up. And tonnages were down, and you can see here that the breakdown from red to white in the tonnages being down. And this is normally what you expect. When tonnages are down, prices tend to go up. But when you look at the inland, whites only down 5%, not really very much. Change in tons down 25%. And then the real killer for the reds down 21% in average value, even though the crush is down 30%. So that's really showing you, unfortunately, that there's a very strong demand effect here. And that despite such a big decrease in tons, or even that's perhaps partly a chosen decrease, the average value still dropped. Now that average value for reds is down, it was down 54% compared with its recent peak of 659. Sorry, I'll show you that here. So for inland reds, they dropped from 659 down to 304. So it has more than halved in those 3 years. Whereas on the other hand, the inland whites have stayed roughly stable for some time, really, and are now higher than reds, which is pretty unusual. And then looking at the cool temperates, the white cool temperate price is actually higher than it's ever been since we've been reporting it, which is probably forever anyway. And then the reds were also higher apart from in this peak in 2020. So I'm sorry, I've kind of jumped around a little bit. So I'll just, this slide was in there again, just to remind you about the mix. So because of the inland taking up less of the mix, that's why the overall average price has been able to increase, even though there was such a drop in that inland price. And this teasing out is really telling you the story about what is driving these drop in prices. It's the inland reds. When we look at price dispersion for the cool temperate whites, comparing 2022, which is the paler line, with 2023, which is the darker line, whites are very similar, except that up in the above 2000 end, we've now got, you know, quite a significant increase in the amount of tons being purchased at that, in that price range. It's really quite unusual. And conversely for reds, there's been a bit of a shift. So more of the reds have gone into the 900 to 1500 range at the expense of the 1600 to 2000 range. And I guess the brutal story here again for the inland reds is this one, where the dark red line shows you that this year there was really, you know, over 20% of reds were purchased at below $300, below $200 a ton, compared with basically none last year. And whites also showed a downward shift, but not by nearly as much. And in the report, there's more detail on this. So over half of all the warm inland reds were purchased at below $300 in 2023, compared with less than 10% in 2022 and only 1% in 2020. So it's been a really stark fall off. And what I'm going to do is move on to look at global wine conditions, because these explain pretty much what's underpinning the fall off in demand for red grapes. So what we have here, in short, global market conditions are very difficult. Since 2019, this slide shows you that overall alcohol, or, you know, all the other categories of alcohol have recovered to being above the 2019 levels. So all the bumpiness during COVID has gone, and you can see that beer is now higher than it was, spirits, RTDs. Wine is the only category that is still in decline, and that's a real structural decline in consumption of wine. So this is global and it's total volume. What's underpinning that is a decline in consumption per capita. So even though the populations are increasing a bit, it's not enough. And again, this blue line here shows you that the total alcohol, sorry, the red line is total alcohol, and that is declining as well, and has been for about the last 5 years, even more. But still wine is declining by more than that. Why? Well, the overall health drive is part of it. So there is an overall reduction in alcohol consumption. And then you've got the competition from other beverages, which I'm sure most of you know about, the RTDs and the spirits, and particularly the younger generations coming up are not taking up wine. They're taking to these other drinks far more. Then your wine drinkers, who are predominantly now over 55, they are tending to drink less. They're often drinking more expensive wine, but they're drinking less in volume. And now we're starting to see the effects of inflation and cost of living pressures, and we don't know how much that's going to affect the next few years, but quite possibly a lot, particularly in markets like the UK and the US that will really feel the effects of inflation. So I'm afraid it is not a good story for wine at all. And the IWSR forecasts that global wine consumption will be flat over the next 5 years, which of course is better than an overall decline. But what you've got is a lot of declines offset by some small increases, say in Asian markets, and some population growth. And then the other thing I want to show you is, this is demand again, the red line. This is now the OIV instead of the International Wine and Spirit Record. So it's a different source, but it's pretty much telling the same story. This is in the past. This is consumption. Now the blue line is production. And as you can see, globally, we've basically been in oversupply for at least the last 10 years. With the notable exception of 2017, which was a really good year for Australia because we had a big vintage that year when everyone else didn't. And so we were, you know, able to sell wine really strongly in the international markets. But other than that, we've got a situation of global oversupply and declining demand for wine. Then the other thing that's happening is within wine, people are premiumizing. So the idea that the red line here is premium, that is showing some growth, and the blue line is commercial wine, so less than $10 a litre, sorry, and that is showing a decline, as you can see. Now, if you think that the premium is offsetting the commercial, unfortunately it's not, because the blue line is on this left-hand scale, which means that it's actually declining by about 200 million litres from now to 2027. Whereas the red line is on the right-hand scale, so that's expected to grow by maybe 30 million cases, sorry, not litres. So what we've got is a loss of 200 million cases, partly offset by a gain of 30 million. So again, the maths does not work out, particularly for commercial wine. And these next two slides show you, they're a bit busy. You'll either love them or you can tune out for a sec. Just look at the bubbles. The bubbles are markets where we sell wine, and the bigger the bubble, the more wine they consume, right? So the big bubbles are the big markets. Then you look at where they're positioned, and the bottom scale shows you how much they've grown over the last 5 years. So the further they are to the right, the better. The vertical axis shows you the projected growth over the next 5 years. So the higher up, the better. So the good markets would be in the top right-hand corner, where the Netherlands and Finland and Switzerland are sitting. But as you can see, the big markets and our big markets, Australia, the United Kingdom, the United States, A, they're the biggest, and B, they're right at the bottom. And this is the demand for commercial wine, so that non-premium wine, and the opportunity is minimal in those big markets. By contrast, for the premium wines, you can see there's quite a few big bubbles sitting up in that top right-hand corner, including the United States and Australia and South Korea even. The United Kingdom has shown some growth, probably won't grow much more. China and Japan may well grow in future, but we know there are issues there. Japan is looking like a good market of opportunity for us. But again, these are premium opportunities. So what this brief summary shows you is that unfortunately wine consumption is declining overall. Production is exceeding it, and the squeeze is being felt the most in commercial wine. And those facts essentially explain to you why the demand for our commercial, the equivalent grape varieties from the inland regions, and particularly reds, but I haven't shown you that analysis for demand, are declining strongly in demand and achieving lower prices. And that does not really look likely to change. So at the moment, these are the CIATI bulk wine prices on the global market, which is a way that we often look at the way that wine is trending. Our wine is not sold on the bulk wine market. It's sold, with a brand on it into a market, but this still sets the benchmark. And this just briefly shows you that generic red, Australian generic red, is currently selling for around 50 cents Australian, which is the equivalent of about $340 a tonne. And for Cabernet Shiraz and Merlot, it's about $420 per tonne equivalent. If you assume 30 cents for processing, that's $210 per tonne. So that only leaves between $100 and $200 for the grower, with no allowance for freight, taxes, storage, or profit for the winery. So that's around that baseline price. That is the current market for our reds. Our whites obviously looking a lot better, as you can see. And finally, I've done a little bit of preliminary analysis on inventory, again, because it looks rather as though, with such a small vintage, smallest in a generation, that should take care of the oversupply. But the problem is, if this is like opening inventory as of last June, and you add in production, as in pretty much what we crushed, turned into litres, and then you take off our domestic and export sales for the last 12 months, the closing inventory for reds does not really change. For whites, it's a little better. The closing inventory is slightly lower, but as you can see, we're still sitting on going into vintage 24, we are likely to be sitting on roughly the same inventory that we're sitting on now, which is not a good sign when we're not seeing growth in demand. So I'm sorry to present all that difficult information. It's definitely not an easy time for wine. But what we can say is that our core demand is somewhere around, say, 1.5 million tonnes. So we're about 80%, we're about 20% oversupplied on current demand levels. But that means that 80% of our sector, and particularly the premium sector, is all in good balance. Now, if you want more information on any of this, as I said to you, the dashboards are all available on our website. There's not just the vintage, there's also exports, there's global wine markets, and there's vineyard information. You can also book a personal session with an analyst, me or my colleague Angelica or Pete Bailey. And that's a personal half-an-hour video call where you can talk about whatever you want, or have a session on how to use the dashboards. Please do. You're not being an inconvenience. It's our jobs. Our jobs. We exist entirely to help the sector be more profitable and make better decisions. So please go ahead and do that. And the other thing I want to mention briefly is that the Australian Grape and Wine and the Wine Australia are taking the lead on a one sector plan, which is a shared vision and plan for the sector, because we need one. We need to look at where we are going over the next few years, given how much things have changed recently. It's got to be done. It will set priorities for the sector to start now. And that is going to be done through consultation with everyone. So please have your say. There's a really simple online survey you can complete, or you'll probably find that there are regional workshops being held in your region. So look out for them and try and make the time to go along, because we all need to be part of this. If you want to know more, get on our website or contact us to find the survey. Just ring up and say, I want to find out about the plan, or can you please send me the link, or whatever. So yeah, please do that. And thank you all very much for your time, and I'll hand back to Matt.
Thanks, Sandy. Just like to remind people, if they've got a question, just to use the Q&A toolbar down the bottom of the screen to type through the question. We have one question that's come through, and it's to do with the regional dashboard. How far back does the regional dashboard go in terms of vintages?
It goes back to 2015 on the screen. So yeah, you can get 2015 for all the regional data, because that's when we started doing the national vintage report in the current format. If you're just looking at price, you can actually go back to 2008 on the price dispersion screen. If you do want data prior to 2015, if you're in a South Australian region, then I recommend the Vine Health Australia website, because that has the SA crush report, and that goes right back to 1990, or no, back to 2000 on their website. If it's a different region, I guess contact me and we'll see if there is any earlier data.
Okay. There hasn't been any other questions come through at this point.
Well, I hope everyone's answering 10 on the scale then.
One question's just come through. I may have missed this part, but did we have an understanding of fruit rejected and fruit not picked because it was unsold?
Okay. Yes, I'm afraid whoever you are, you've just owned up to missing the first few minutes, because yeah, I did discuss that. It is a very valid question that people would like to know the answer to, but unfortunately, because we record the crush, we don't know what didn't get crushed. So we can only think anecdotally. But what I said before was, I believe that the main driver was seasonal for a few reasons. However, what we don't know is, if we'd had a really good season, would we then still have ended up crushing about the same, because then we would have seen more rejections. Whereas, because there wasn't that much out there in the first place, we didn't see as many rejections as we might have seen.
Okay. We haven't had any more questions come through, but as Sandy's indicated, if anyone would like to get in contact with Sandy, we can provide those details, and I'm sure Sandy will be more than willing to answer a question should that come through later today.
Yeah, you can email either me directly or as per that previous slide, market.insights@wineaustralia.com. And yeah, ask any question you like, preferably related to vintage or wine.
Okay, that's great. Thanks, Sandy. Then I'd like to thank Sandy for providing a great snapshot into the Australian Vintage Report and also providing some great avenues for getting more information through Wine Australia's website. And I'd also like to thank the audience for logging in today and taking part. And just like to remind you that, as always, you will receive a link to view the recording of this presentation, which will be available on the Adabri's YouTube channel later today. The next Adabri webinar is on next Thursday, and the topic being soil health, carbon and undervine management in a dry climate. So if you'd like to register for this session, please visit the Adabri website. Thank you again, and I look forward to seeing you all at the next Adabri webinar.